ARE Podcast, episode number 7.
Welcome to the ARE Podcast. Where it's all about encouraging and inspiring you today so you can fulfill your dream of becoming a licensed architect tomorrow. And now your host. He once gave a speech about the effects of acid rain at his high school graduation. David Doucette.
Hello, and welcome to our episode number 7 of the ARE Podcast here. We're joined with Eric Corey Freed, who is in San Francisco this week. Last week, Boston. This week, San Francisco. You just travel around.
I have a more exciting life than you do.
I'm just wondering when we're going to have the show when you're in the south of France or somewhere luxurious like that.
I think we have one coming up, and I'm in Vermont. That'll be very exciting.
There you go. All right. So today's topic, we're going to talk about architects and the movies, and this was inspired by an article that came out of Arc Daily last fall. So this has been on our to-do list for a while, and it actually allowed me a few opportunities to see some movies from the 90s that I actually haven't seen before. So we have several movies we're going to talk about. We're not trying to cover all the movies because there's a whole bunch out there, and ones featuring Adam Sandler I have no interest in talking about. So that's not on our list here. So let's jump right into probably one of the more interesting ones on our list is Inception, which came out a couple of years ago in 2010, of course, written and directed by Christopher Nolan and starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Tom Hardy, and Ellen Page. And this is an interesting one because of the role of the architect in this one, but also who is actually playing the architect. So, Eric, do you want to give us a quick synopsis of Inception, if that's even possible? Because, it's a crazy one.
It's a pretty complicated movie if you haven't seen it. But essentially, Leonardo DiCaprio plays someone who was trained as an architect and now performs what's called extraction. And he essentially is able to go into people's dreams, recreate a world inside of their head, and then use it for espionage and finding out information. That's kind of his job. And it turns out that they have, a giant job to do, and they have to recruit a big team to do it. And that's where these other cast members come in. He
basically goes into the brain to essentially alter the subconscious so they can get a real-world desired result, essentially.
Yes, exactly. The idea is that your deepest, darkest secrets are buried up here. And by diving into your dreams, he's able to do that. But it's a visually stunning movie on top of all of that kind of suspense and thrill.
It really is, and I've never been I know people think anything that Christopher Nolan, writes or directs, he's basically like a god. I've never been in that camp, so I was actually a little suspicious going into this movie, but I'm not really a big sort of dream altered state kind of movie guy. Maybe because I saw Dreamscape in the 80s and it just ruined it for me. But this was really well done. The characters were great. Everybody was great. And the visuals were awesome. And one of the things I want to talk about as we talk about each of these movies is, is the role of architect in the movie, is it important to the movie, or is it something that really could have just been any other profession, or any other role in the movie? So this first one, Eric, so why don't you tell us about Ellen Page, who plays our young heroine, who is, I'll say this, she's actually not a licensed architect. She's still an architecture student, but she is the architect in the movie. They don't say the school, but it's clearly the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris that she's studying. She's an American architecture student, and she's the favorite student of Leonardo DiCaprio's father. That's how they meet. And her name is Ariadne, which is it's a cool name, but for those that don't know, that actually comes from Greek mythology. She's the daughter of Minos.
and she's in Greek mythology. Ariadne is famous for drawing mazes, and that's what Ellen Page's character ends up doing a lot in the movie is developing these mazes.
See, that's why I actually have you on this podcast, because I actually didn't know that. No, I didn't know that.
That was, yeah, when I was watching the movie and they said Ariadne, I'm like, brilliant. Oh, that's just so smart.
And so obviously in this particular instance, the role of the architect that Ellen Page plays, obviously it's central to the movie and the whole point of the movie. I mean, this is not, you couldn't just substitute her for an attorney or some other white collar profession. I mean, this is central to the story. Well,
you could, yeah, if it was an attorney, first of all, you couldn't afford it. The movie would go over budget. But also, no, it's her key role is creating these dream worlds that they're within, and the dream worlds need to be realistic enough, but can't be drawn from an actual place. There's many subtexts in this movie, and one of them is that it's very easy to confuse dream world with reality, and it's easy to get lost in one and not know which is real and what's not.
Yeah, we have actually several quotes here, and I think maybe what might come out of this is we might actually do just one day an own show dedicated just to Inception, because there's a lot of fascinating stuff here. But when Leonardo DiCaprio's character, when he's talking to her, he talks about. Well, let me just read the quote here. They're talking about a location of two mirrors, and he says, very impressive. And she says, I know this bridge. He says, I know this bridge. This place is real, isn't it? And she says, yeah, I cross it every day on the way to the college. And he says, never recreate places from your memory. Always imagine new places. And she says, well, you got to draw from stuff right? And he says, only use the details, a street lamp or a phone booth, never entire areas. And she says, why not? And he says, because building a dream from your memory is the easiest way to lose your grasp on what's real and what is a dream. And then she says, is that what happened to you? So I think that's really interesting, this idea of, creating this world that she's tasked with creating and not doing it from memory.
Kind of makes you want to, print that out and send it to Robert A.M. Stern or one of those classicist type guys, right? Where they're not quite, they don't know what's quite real and what's quite a dream anymore with their own work.
And I think just this idea of using your imagination, and I think what's cool about her role is, first off, she's female, and the profession of architecture, like it or not, is still a pretty male-dominated profession. And so it's interesting that he would write her, or write this young female architecture student into the storyline, and she's really the glue that holds the whole team together. I mean, she's a force to be reckoned with here.
Yeah, it seems like they never make mention of Leo's character's mother. We meet the father, but we don't know where the mother is. I think it's kind of implied that she's watching his two children back in the States, but there almost needs to be more of a maternal presence, and she becomes it. She becomes the one that he confesses to, reveals his deep secret that he's kept from the rest of the team, which I don't want to ruin for anybody who hasn't seen the movie. But so she plays a nice role. The trouble is that it's hard to look at her and not think of Juno every time you see her. That's my instinct there.
Yeah, it is interesting that she is the one that that he trusts. And I mean, they don't become, if I remember correctly, I mean, it's not a romantic connection that they have, if I remember. I mean, it's just a very sort of respect for it's a respect for their equals, I guess.
I think the intent is that it's more brotherly, sisterly, and the fact that the father introduced them kind of reinforces that. Plus, they're so different in form. She's very little, he's very tall. All of that, I think, was part of the deliberate casting. She looks like a young college student, and so he wouldn't have any. It wouldn't be romantic in any way. It would just be more of a kind of familial type of relationship.
And I think that's what I found. I really liked her in the role, and the fact that she is this sort of young architect. So at first you're thinking like, well, she doesn't have sort of the experience, whatever that experience is, to create this stuff. but she's very believable in the role. She's very good, and kudos obviously to Christopher Nolan for writing sort of this young female character that really holds the movie together.
Right, and named her after a figure in Greek mythology.
Right. He's so smart, that Christopher Nolan.
Yeah.
I'll do one more quote, and then we'll move to the next movie. This is near the beginning. The professor, he says to her, "Mr. Cobb has a job offer he would like to discuss with you," and she says, "Like a work placement?" And he says, "Not exactly." And then I don't know if this is right in that same situation, but she says, "Won't you tell me anything about this first?" And he says, "Before I describe the job, I have to know you can do it." And she asks, "Why?" And he says, "It's not, strictly speaking, legal." So there you go. Yeah, fascinating movie. It's long. I think it was like 2.5 hours, wasn't it? Or more.
Yeah, I want to say that to the next person I interview when they go, "Well, before I tell you about the job, I need to know that you can do it," right. Because it's not, strictly speaking, legal.
Right, that is a good one to use. All right, so that is Inception, fascinating movie, and certainly one of the more interesting ones that we have on our list. So I think we could both agree that the role of architect is central to the movie and the plot and everything that happens in the movie. Next up is something that is not quite as serious, One Fine Day, which I hadn't seen in the 90s, so I watched this last week. 1996, Michelle Pfeiffer and George Clooney. She is essentially an architect who's a single mom living in New York City with a 6-year-old son, and she's supposed to be, doing well. And then one day she meets George Clooney, who's a bit of a mess with his daughter that he doesn't see that often. And then through some mishaps and stuff, they end up connecting throughout the movie. So, let's talk about her role as an architect first. What do you make of this, Eric?
Well, this to me is the typical Hollywood portrayal of an architect, like harried, overworked, probably underpaid, always with errant strands of hair coming out, and she's frantic, and she's, in the movie she's a single mom and she's got a little kid, and just disheveled and wrinkled and almost kind of a bit of a fool or a bumbling moron. And that's kind of the way they portray us a lot of the time in the movies. And it's weird because you figure a profession that's so based on precision and engineering on one side and then art on the other, why would they be portraying us like that? Wouldn't we be what we are, which is, dress better than an average professional, usually don't have wrinkles on us. I don't know. It just seems, roles like this kind of annoy me because I think they perpetuate this stereotype of that we're almost absent-minded.
Yeah, definitely, and she in the 90s. I mean, she was one of the it girls. She's a pretty powerful actor at the time, and she could have pulled off sort of a more real life architect, but she was like a bumbling idiot. Like she kept getting her stuff on her clothes, and I'm like, I'm a single dad with 2 boys. Okay, it's like I'm not a bumbling idiot. Granted, I'm not living in New York City and having to hurry around to sort of subways and taxis and all that stuff. It's a little slower here on the West Coast. But yeah, I'm just like, what a bumbling idiot. Like this is not, an architect. And that one scene where she's like grabbing the model and walking through the office, which by the way, at her level, she's not going to be carrying a model through the office. There's going to be some model maker person doing that. And then she trips and falls and smashes the model. I mean, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, it was much more of a plot device for the movie, for comic relief, than anything central to the plot. But I think it's one of those professions also that sounds romanticized, that she's somewhat serious in her career, so they tend to use that. But it's, if she had been an accountant, that would come off as boring. An architect seems a little more interesting, exciting, but it ended up being just a kind of a trip and fall joke at the end of it.
It really did, and I think you touched on it there, that that if they can write an architect into the movie, Hollywood feels like they already have this backstory of, hey, we got this person who's smart, they're on it, so they don't have to cover that, so they can get right to sort of, in this case, the shtick of, of making an architect look like a bumbling idiot a little bit. All right, so next up is okay. So with that one, I guess the role of the architect not really central to the movie per se, but like you said, if it was an accountant or somebody else, it would have been boring. I wouldn't say the movie was boring, but it was just silly. But I guess if it was an accountant, it would have been silly and boring, or probably not even silly. But anyway, all right. Next up, house sitter, and these are in no particular order. They're actually in the order.
They're not even in chronological.
Not even in chronological order. They're just the way I put them in our show notes in Evernote. So, House Sitter, 1992. So this I just watched last night, and I can see
this is a good movie.
Really? Okay. All right. All right. So it stars Steve Martin and Goldie Hawn, which, by the way, I was reading on IMDb. And this is in the 90s, early 90s, where Meg Ryan, she was the it girl. She turned this role down. Then it went out to Kim Basinger. She turned it down, and then Goldie Hawn took it. So, Eric, give us the plot line here for House Sitter.
Well, first of all, Goldie Hawn and Steve Martin, both comedic geniuses. You can't go wrong there. Their chemistry is wonderful. But Steve Martin is an architect who built this lavish modernist dream house with this very cool breezeway down the middle, which I really liked. In somewhere in Massachusetts, and this con artist played by Goldie Hawn finds out it's vacant and moves into it, and then starts telling people she's his wife, but his life is a mess, and so the people in this little town start, what do you mean you're his wife? And she starts just making up stuff, and it's not knowing anything about the profession, but it's interesting to see how people perceive the profession here. It's also interesting to see it all take place in this house that was kind of the central showpiece of the story. It is a beautiful house, but I do have one complaint with it, which I'll get to in a minute. But go ahead. Yeah,
and actually, you left off the beginning of the movie, and maybe because I watched it last night, it's very fresh in my mind. But one thing, when I saw the house, I'm sort of like, okay, there's some cool things here. And keep in mind, this is in New England, where I'm, where I grew up and I went to architecture school. There's not a whole lot of deviation of the norm there. And then you come out to the West Coast, especially if you look at Venice, you're like, wow. But anyway, I looked at it, I'm like, this looks like this is like the movie studio built this thing. And then of course I went to IMDb, and they built it for the movie, and they tore it down shortly afterwards.
That's my issue with the house, that it's and this is a subtle thing in the movie. He's in New England. They establish that it's in New England, and he builds what could easily be called a California ranch house. So it as much as I like that he's an architect, and he's not a bumbling idiot as an architect. He's a bumbling idiot in relationships, but not as an architect. What I don't like about it is that it shows that the architect is ignoring the context, ignoring the vernacular, ignoring the climate, and plunking this dream house because he didn't get to do it in his own profession. None of his clients would let him build what he wanted, and now he's building this thing, and it's completely inappropriate for it's got a breezeway in New England, if that gives you any indication.
Yeah, with all glass, by the way.
All glass, yeah. So it wouldn't pass the energy modeling in Massachusetts now.
In 1992, they probably actually could get away with it. But it is funny because, he's definitely a bumbling idiot in his relationship, but actually a respected architect somewhat in his firm, although, he's in the biggest architectural firm in New England. And the firm owner doesn't even know who he is, as we kind of find out in the movie. But his peers respect him. But right at the beginning, and to kind of set the stage, what he does is for not Goldie Hawn, but Dana Delaney, who he wants to be his fiance, he builds this house out in the country. Blindfolder drives her there in his convertible Mustang, which is a cool architect car. Puts a big ribbon around the entire house, takes her blindfold off, and says that he loves her and will you marry me? And she says no, and that's why the house sits vacant for a few months, and then obviously he crosses paths with Goldie Hawn.
Now Dana Delaney was hot off of the Northern Exposure TV show at the time.
Okay.
If you remember. So she never made it big in the movies, but I remember this one being one of the few movies that she ended up doing after Northern Exposure. And she played opposite her normal casting. Instead of playing the love interest, she played the one that broke his heart.
Right.
Which is a little subtle.
Well,
I also didn't like the whole idea that he would design an entire house and not get input from the other resident. I didn't like that part either.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, that's but to his point, I mean, and to probably maybe Hollywood did get that right, because there are a lot of architects who would be like, well, I don't need anyone else's opinion. It's my house, right? And then just let the spouse, not consider the spouse, in the process.
But you have to remember, at a time when we complain that people assume that architects ignore their clients' wishes, build whatever they want, don't build what the client actually asked for. Here's a movie basically proving that, basically showing, yeah, he built it for his fiance with no input from her whatsoever. I wouldn't, if let's say she said yes, right?
Right.
She miraculously said yes. They moved in. Wouldn't a week go by and she go, well, can we remodel the bathroom a little bit because I really wanted a makeup mirror, and can we change the kitchen a little bit because I wanted this, and I really wanted an office for myself. Can we do an addition? And that's what would happen in real life.
Well, that would be House Sitter 2. That would be the sequel.
We'll write that.
Yeah, right. There's a couple of quotes that I thought were good here. So Goldie Hawn, who develops a friendship with Dana Delaney in sort of an oddball way, but that's sort of the spirit of the movie. The movie is very 90s. I mean, it's the kind of thing, if it came out today, you'd be like, but Steve Martin and Goldie Hawn certainly make it work. So, Goldie Hawn, who just makes everything up, makes up this story of how she met, Steve Martin's character. So they're talking about it, and Goldie Hawn says she was in the hospital. She got hit by a car, and she was all bandaged up. And Steve Martin's character came and visited her every day, and then he eventually paid for her bill. So Dana Delaney asks her, well, how long were you there? And she's like, 2 weeks. So Dana Delaney's like, well, how's he affording this? So she says, but how could he afford that? And he's got all this money in that house. And Goldie Hawn says, oh, well, he's an architect, and laughs. The perception that architects make a bunch of money. Now, she dated Steve Martin's character, so she says, yeah, but he's just an associate. It really doesn't pay very much. And then Goldie Hawn says, yeah, well, he got promoted. And then Dana Delaney says, he has. And Goldie Hawn says, oh, yeah, they love him over there. He's kicking big architectural butt. So that was kind of funny. And unfortunately, Dana Delaney's character about, but it doesn't really pay very much. We've all been there. I mean, I think we've talked about this before in a lot of in episodes before. A lot of us architects are sort of it's like the cobbler's kids who has no shoes, right? We can design these awesome, really expensive houses for clients, but not all of us can live in the kind of houses we design.
Yeah, we should have been designing shoes.
Right.
Is that your point?
No, that wasn't my point. There really wasn't a point.
I'm not sure what your point is.
The other quote I want to share here, which I thought was good, Steve Martin's firm, there's his sidekick, who is essentially Peter Keating from the Fountainhead. He's just this guy. He's going to design anything to make himself look good and just to be popular. So they're midway through the movie. Steve Martin was at his desk all night, and he came up with some brilliant solution to whatever they're working on. And his friend says, it is so depressing to work alongside someone of your caliber. When did you come up with this? And Steve Martin says, oh, I don't know, this morning or last night. Again, feeding into that architect's work all the time. We'll pull all-nighters. And he says, you were here all night? And then Steve Martin says, so what do you think? Can you show this to Mosby? Mosby is a firm owner who likes his friend. So, now that Steve Martin, he's gunning for the promotion. And I do love the honesty here. I think this is pretty funny. His friend says, nah, you better do it. And Steve Martin says, yeah, but he likes you. And then he says, and you got to love the sort of writing and the truthfulness of this. And I'm sure a lot of us can relate to this in the architectural practice. He says, yeah, but because when Mosby goes on about how brilliant it is, I'm going to take the credit. And Steve Martin says, well, you're my friend. Why would you do that? Where are your ethics? And his friend says, my ethics are I'm your friend and I'm not going to screw you over. So I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah, I like that movie. It's a funny movie. The thing I didn't like was the design of the house itself. But I mean, I guess that would be true for any movie featuring a custom design.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So now the role of the architect, I guess it is central, to the story there because it's about the house and Goldie Hawn moving into the house. Steve Martin, I think, is a respectable architect and sort of bumbling in his relationship is kind of the summary, right?
Yeah, and he dresses very architecturally too. I think they did a good job of that, and even showing the office was fairly realistic.
Yeah, that was good. And the little eraser. I don't even know what the little metal, the erasing shield, right?
Eraser shield.
Eraser shield. Yeah, and how he was just erasing stuff here and there, and you put a door next to the wall. I used one
yesterday.
Did you really? Oh my god.
Yeah, I still draw by hand.
I got a box in storage of all that stuff. Maybe I should ship it out to you in Palm Springs so it'll get some use.
Yeah, please do. I'll use it.
All right, next up is Death Wish. Now, have you seen this, by the way?
Yeah, 30 years ago.
Okay, for whatever reason,
I don't remember it.
I never saw this one. I think I've probably seen Death Wish 2 or Death Wish 12 or whatever, but I never remember seeing the original, which is 1974, starring Charles Bronson. And the plot is basically Charles Bronson is a New York City architect, and his wife and daughter are attacked at their home, and his wife is murdered by 3 street punks, and one of them actually is Jeff Goldblum. And so he becomes bent on being a vigilante. Now, what's interesting, he's not trying to get revenge on the people who did this to his family. He's just trying to act revenge on crime in New York City because in the 70s, crime was rampant, and he was trying to take things into his own hands because the police weren't doing anything about it. So this is based on a book by Brian Garfield. Now, here's what I found interesting. I watched this movie probably about a month ago, and I have to say, I did like it. I mean, for the 70s, I am a Charles Bronson fan. He did some great Western stuff in the 60s. But he's not, he doesn't start off as a vigilante, which I think the important part of making him or having him being an architect is to show him as somebody who is a smart individual, well-rounded, like doing the right things. And then this sort of, major event happens and it affects him. Because there's this one part at the beginning when he's deciding that he needs to do something about it. He's filling a sock with quarters, and he's trying to swing it around like he's going to use that for revenge on somebody who's trying to get money from him or something like that. So he's a little bit of a bumbling, like he's not just the vigilante we think of, that we know him now. So there's this one quote in his firm. He's working in a high-profile architecture, kind of like an architecture design build firm, development firm. And his friend in the firm says to Charles Bronson, decent people are going to have to work here and live somewhere else. And Charles Bronson says, by decent people, you mean people who can afford to live somewhere else. And his friend says, oh, Christ, you're such a bleeding heart liberal, Paul. And he says, my heart bleeds a little for the underprivileged, yes. And, his friend says, the underprivileged are beating our goddamn brains out. You know what I say? Stick them in the concentration camps. That's what I say. So it shows Charles Bronson as sort of this compassionate guy. And it's kind of not on surface level. There's other dialogue that happens. So you sort of, you like Charles Bronson's character, until he starts, becoming a vigilante. So,
well, he's a protagonist. You're supposed to like him. So
exactly.
They humanize him at the beginning. He suffers this loss, and then you're rooting for him at that. I mean, that's kind of that's the idea.
Yeah, that's the idea.
But it's also, remember, 1974. That's 30 years after World War II. It's still fresh in a lot of people's minds. So It's not like today where it seems like this abstract, distant thing, So that's also kind of an interesting bit of the context.
Well, there was also some environmental dialogue. I remember he flew out to, I think it was Arizona, where they were going to build this big complex, and he was there with a real estate agent, and the real estate agent said, "No, we can't get rid of those hills because his character was saying, we got to flatten the hills so we can have more land to build." And the real estate developer was like, "No, we got to leave those hills." And then he's like, "But we're going to lose some space." And they're like, "Okay." And then Charles Bronson's character goes back and sells that, to his people in New York. Like, "No, we got to keep these hills. We want to protect the environment, not kill trees." So there was definitely some sort of sustainable stuff going on, and they didn't even know they were doing it, kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, also 4 years earlier was the birth of the environmentalist movement with the first Earth Day, the Clean Water Act, the establishment of the EPA. So set in context, it kind of makes sense that suddenly now this was a big issue in the early part of the 70s, basically right up until Ronald Reagan became president in 1980. But right up until then, remember Jimmy Carter came on the air with a sweater on saying, "Turn down your heat, damn it." So
right.
I think it was part of the mentality at the time.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I mean, they make his character a bleeding heart liberal, as he sort of self-admits. So, so Death Wish 4, check it out. The one scene, I will say, of sort of his family being sort of, it's even today to watch that, it's like, oh, that's a little tough to take, but, All right, next up, Indecent Proposal. 1993. So this is when I was in my sort of, I guess, second or third year of architecture school. So I could, we could relate to this. Robert Redford, Woody Harrelson, Demi Moore. Eric, what's the premise?
Well, first of all, great movie. It's a good pick. Demi Moore, just looking gorgeous, of course. And the premise is that this architect, played by Woody Harrelson, and his insanely hot real estate agent wife, Demi Moore, they end up in Vegas. They have this house, this dream house they've been trying to build. They're halfway through. The bank pulled the funding, and they have this crazy idea that they're going to go to Vegas and win the rest to complete this house. And the loan's coming due. It's creating a sense of drama. They go to Las Vegas. They bet. Their first night is awesome. They're winning. It looks like they're going to get the money. They have this great scene where she's rolling around in money on the bed in the hotel. Real hot. And then the next day, start losing it all. And then they reach a point of desperation. And it's all shot very well, actually. And then suddenly, observing this is this high roller, played by Robert Redford, who's in, the $2,000 suit and watching, and he's admiring the wife. And he sees them fall hard on their luck, and he goes and presents them with this indecent proposal. "I'll give you $1 million for one night with your wife," which is a great premise, by the way. And anybody who's married, I guarantee you, they've had this discussion. Would you not?
I remember in Boston, I mean, this was in the newspapers. This was like a big deal when this movie came out. Like everybody was asking that question,
And my wife, last time we watched it together, my wife's like, $1 million to sleep with Robert Redford? Yeah. I'm like, honey, think about it a little bit. Let's take some time. Don't. But she seemed very, very game.
As did Demi Moore. As did Demi Moore. And then it kind of shows what happens to them afterwards. Very similar to what I didn't like about the other one. What's it? House Sitter. In that the house that Woody Harrelson designed, that was half finished, half done, half undone. Didn't quite fit any context. It was kind of out in the middle of nowhere on this piece of land. There was no context around it. It was this dream house with that same premise that he couldn't build what he wanted to for clients, so now he's building his big vision, and this was going to make him somehow the next Frank Lloyd Wright. Would this, and it is interesting how Hollywood does portray us as the architect with these ideas of wanting to build a dream house, right? I mean, House Sitter, Indecent Proposal. There's probably some others because we all want to do it. Let's face it.
We all do, but hopefully we design something a little more contextual. I would think. I'd hope anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
So is the role of an architect, is that central to the movie? Like, could Woody Harrelson could have been any other profession? What do you think?
I think it's central because it's central in that it's the device they use to need to go to Vegas in the first place. It shows his comeback. They have a great scene after he loses his wife and loses the house that he then has to get a job. And there's a wonderful scene where he's in with this guy that looks like right out of Central Casting, the quintessential architect, old guy with the glasses on the end of his nose, saying, "You're overqualified." And Woody Harrelson goes, "Exploit me."
Right.
Remember that scene? It's a great scene. I'm getting chills just telling you about it.
I don't, but did you just see this last night? Because you're like you really.
No, I have a good memory. And then he goes back to teaching too. So he's working by day, he's teaching at night, and he gives this passionate lecture to the students, which was great.
Right.
And a lecture that you wish that you really got in school.
Yeah.
But he's going through. And then he's talks about Liu Kang. He's got a little monologue about Liu Kang.
I remember that. Yeah, I do remember that.
That was awesome. So is the architect central to the story? Well, they probably could have found another profession, but it really gets into the character development, talking about his personality, the way he thinks. And she's in real estate. Robert Redford is a millionaire because he's a big developer. So it's all centered around that. So I say yes.
Yeah, just actually hearing you explain it, I think you're probably right. Actually, I was just thinking not, but I think it might be, and the reason is because they're trying to build their dream house. So there's a lot on the line here. It's not just a couple who wants to just buy a house. I mean, this is his dream house, and if we make him an architect, he's invested in that dream house, and he's passionate about it. He's smart, and So I think you might be right.
I read on IMDb that in the first draft, he was a plastic surgeon, and they were saving up to get her a breast reduction.
Are you serious?
That was no.
Oh.
You're so trusting. No.
Actually, I had moved on to the next movie, so that I was half listening to you.
But the premise of a dream house is I think it's a good literal device.
It is, for sure.
Literary device.
Yeah, and I guess if we're going to have a movie about a dream house, then one of the main characters has to be an architect, right? I mean,
And it was, by the way, it was directed by Adrian Lin, who also directed one of my other favorite movies, Flashdance, which is had nothing to do with an architect at all. It's just a good movie.
All right, next up on our list, probably some of you haven't even been born when this one came out, The Towering Inferno, 1974. I haven't seen this in many, many, many years, but for some reason I remember this one. Of course, starring Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, William Holden, who was in a couple of good westerns, and Faye Dunaway. And the typical disaster movie. And this is Eric and I were joking about we should make The Towering Inferno its own episode, because you go to IMDb, there's some funny dialogue there that we can relate to today versus architects versus what builders wanted to.
There are some great quotes in that movie, and some of them, some of the little film clips of these quotes are things that I wanted to use in my presentations, because there's the one where. He says, "I thought we were building something where people would be safe to live and work. If you had to cut costs, why don't you just cut floors instead of cutting corners?" And that's just a great little soundbite. I just love it. And they have a whole thing about building codes. And then at one point,
go ahead.
Paul Newman says,
"Who? Well, let's set it up. Let's set it up first. Paul Newman's the architect, right?
Paul Newman's the architect. The fire chief, Steve McQueen."
And Paul Newman, the architect, I mean, he was big at this time. So, he's a big actor. He's the architect in this movie. Yeah, go ahead.
And the fire chief goes, "Architects," like that. That's a great soundbite. But then Paul Newman goes, "Yeah, it's all our fault." And the fire chief says, "No, there's no sure way for us to fight a fire in anything over the 7th floor. But you guys just keep building them as high as you can." And it's like, ooh, and then Newman comes back and says, "Hey, are you here to take me on or the fire?" And it's it's a great little scene, a great little clip. I've been wanting to use that in a presentation forever, and I don't know where to use it in, but it's a great movie just to watch from that perspective.
It really is. I mean, those are some of the biggest actors of the day. I mean, Steve McQueen and Paul Newman head to head, right there. And I haven't seen this movie in probably, I don't know, 25, 30 years. And I remember that scene like it was yesterday. And I don't know why, but just that, oh, you architects just keep building them higher and higher, you know? Crazy.
It's and also the timing of it is also interesting. 74 is the year the Twin Towers were built.
Right.
At least started. So this idea of going higher and higher, and that's when the questioning started. Like, well, why do we need to build so high? It was kind of an interesting point for skyscrapers in general, and this idea about fire safety. It's also when a lot of the codes started being implemented in terms of means of egress and fire passage doors, and we had to learn painful mistakes from people dying in other fires, if you remember.
Yeah, and I remember one of the scenes because basically the premise of the movie is this skyscraper was poorly built. The contractor or the builder just cut corners. I remember there was this one scene I think where they're trying to get out a fire door and they can't because there's basically cement and a wheelbarrow like stuck in front of the fire, so they can't open it, kind of thing. And the building owner or the developer, when he's fighting with Paul Newman, he says, now listen, any decisions that were made for the use of alternative building materials were made because I, as a builder, have a right to make those decisions. If I remain within the building code, and God damn it, I did. So he's thinking, if I remain in the building code, I'm good, which they didn't even do that.
Right. It also, I think it portrays architects in a positive light in that, oh yeah, we're not just creating pretty boxes now, we're actually protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public. That's what I do like about the movie, is it shows us as responsible professionals.
Yeah, he's definitely. I think Paul Newman portrayed as sort of a heroic character, and as sort of, I guess, as well as a disaster movie can portray an architect. That's a pretty good job, because right. Really they blame all the fault is on the builder. Even the architect is there blaming the builder. Of course, we don't do that nowadays.
Yeah, but that phrase "Towering Inferno" became a meme for quite a while, and I would say that anybody over the age of 40 would probably still use that. If let's say you're doing CA for a high rise, you can go, well, you might joke and say, well, we don't want a towering inferno on our hands, or it was a word that we were using in the profession. I remember through the 80s as a thing, wasn't it? Or did I just dream that?
I think you dreamt that. All right, next movie is Sleepless in Seattle, 1993. I saw this years ago. I'm going to be honest here. I don't remember too much of it, and I remember the end where they're on, I don't know, some New York City, Rockefeller, wherever they are, the Empire State Building, and she comes
Empire State Building.
All right, Empire State Building.
Are you serious?
So, directed by Nora Ephron, Tom Hanks, and Meg Ryan, who did like Joe on the Volcano or something, around that.
Joe versus Volcano.
Thank you.
I can't believe it. I think it was the second of 3 movies they ended up doing together.
Yeah.
That were all kind of in a row. And it's a great one. He lives on a houseboat in Seattle where the famous quote, Meg Ryan says to her friend, played by, what's her name, the talk show host? Darn it.
Oprah?
Rosie O'Donnell.
Oh, okay.
Oprah. Having a conversation, and Meg Ryan is fantasizing about Tom Hanks, who she hasn't even met yet. And she said, well, maybe I'll move to Seattle. And then her friends go, it rains 9 months out of the year in Seattle. Like, no sane person would move to Seattle. And he lives on a houseboat. Every scene, it's raining. He's walking up the hill at Pike's Place Market. It really shows Seattle beautifully, I think, as a rainy but beautiful place. And she's in New York. And then plus they end up having this great scene at the end of the Empire State Building, which is all based on An Affair to Remember, if you remember, which they reference in the movie. Right. And Patricia O'Neal's big scene, and the 2 women are saying, why don't men get this movie? You don't remember any of that?
No, none.
Oh. But as an architect, he's mostly just seen carrying around these kind of vague rolls of drawings.
Okay.
And that's kind of it.
Okay. So they don't develop. Go ahead.
His best friend is a contractor played by Rob Reiner. Okay.
So they don't develop.
Go ahead.
They don't develop the sort of architect character then at all.
They do in that it shows him as a sensitive soul. But my favorite scene is that he's fixed up on a date with a woman, and who would an architect meet but an interior designer? So he's fixed up with this interior designer named Victoria, I remember, who has the worst laugh known to man. And like a cringing type of laugh, like a deal breaker laugh.
Right.
But he's fixed up on this date by the contractor. And then they have a great scene with the client where they're in construction and the client's like, I must tear down that wall. I must. She's this like disconnected, rich, buffoony client, which I kind of like. And architect and contractor are side by side and in lockstep in saying, but client, that's a bearing wall. That's a load bearing wall. To take it down, it might end up costing us $2, $3, $4, $5, $10,000, whatever it costs. That's what the client says. And it's a great scene showing how the client is sometimes the unreasonable one and suddenly willing to spend anything they want if it's something that they truly desire.
Okay.
But you don't remember any of that.
I don't. None of it. None of. I think of Meg Ryan in the '90s, and I just think of the Harry Met Sally diner scene. I mean, that's my memory of Meg Ryan in the '90s.
To me, Meg Ryan embodied the perfect woman in the early '90s.
Oh yeah, she was the it girl. I mean,
just with the hair and the mouth and the face and the personality and the humor and everything. And I don't know if you've seen her now, but she's got.
Oh yeah, plastic surgery gone bad.
She looks like the Joker.
I mean, it's she was offered House Sitter first, which House Sitter was a year before this. I mean, in fact, Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan could have done House Sitter.
Yeah, it would have been a good movie.
All right, next,
I would have gone to see that.
Next up is The Fountainhead, 1949, and again, this is actually probably just the book itself. We could do a podcast episode on, but. Obviously, a novel by, and forgive me, but I say Ayn Rand. I know everyone likes to say Ayn Rand, but it's Ayn Rand to me. Gary Cooper and Patricia Neal. Eric, what's it about here?
Well, the book is probably been read by everybody who's listening. Every architect I've ever met has read this book at least once. And the movie can no way, of course, capture the entire epic of the book. And almost doesn't try to. It cuts a lot of corners in the plot in order to fit it into within a 2-ish hour time frame. But it plays a wonderful Gary Cooper with the most impressive looking architect's hands you've ever seen.
Right.
They look like David's hands sculpted out of marble. And Patricia Neal, who's just gorgeous in the movie, and as this unrelenting, uncompromising visionary of an architect who will starve before he lets one of his buildings get built poorly. And aside from the fact that that's kind of nuts and self-defeating,
right.
it's still a powerful story. And the only sad part is that I kind of hate that all of Ayn Rand's books have been kind of co-opted by the whole Tea Party movement now. That the idea of objectivism is somehow some political manifesto. I forget all that stuff. But just as a book about architecture, it is a great book. His famous quote, I don't build in order to have clients. I have clients in order to build.
Right. Yeah.
I have some great trivia on this movie, though, that you don't know.
Go ahead.
Ayn Rand approached Frank Lloyd Wright and asked him if he would provide the drawings and models for the movie.
Get out.
And he said, yes, I'd be happy to. I'll charge you $1 million. And they couldn't.
Wow.
So they ended up going with very Wright-like looking drawings. In fact, there's one scene where Gary Cooper's holding a drawing with a big slash through it of a thing that was unbuilt, and he wrote "unbuilt" on it. And it's a total rip-off of a tower that Wright did in Dallas that was also unbuilt. But they tweaked it, I guess, just enough not to get sued.
And how about the Peter Keating, who we've all seen a Peter Keating in our office at one time or another, which is you want to read the quote there that we have for Peter Keating?
Peter says, you can't hope to survive unless you learn how to compromise. Now watch me. In just a few short years, I'll shoot to the top of the architectural profession because I'm going to give the public what it wants. And Peter Keating ends up being, and this is, I think, sadly prevalent in our profession. He gives the client what they want, not what they need. And he ends up regretting his life at the end.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of the Peter Keating character, is you're supposed to hate him from the start. And at the end, he ends up regretting that life and trying to make amends for it.
You know what's interesting in our one last Howard Rourke quote here, where he says, "A building has integrity just as a man and just as seldom. It must be true to its own idea, have its own form, and serve its own purpose." So obviously Howard Rourke was an idealist. And, you know, I think you're right about the whole Ayn Rand sort of objectivism thing. I mean, I don't even pay any attention to that stuff. I love the Fountainhead. I loved Atlas Shrugged. I mean, I just, you know, and I didn't get into all the other stuff that sort of seems to surround her, or the philosophies or stuff. But it's interesting because I read the Fountainhead. I was probably 22, so probably about 20 years ago, and loved the book. Then Atlas Shrugged. I'm actually listening to it now on Audible. I've been on it for a few months, but I have to tell you, listening to it now, it's great. I'm probably halfway through it. You know, when we're young, when we're in our 20s, we look at Howard Rourke and be like, yeah, I want to be like him. What an idealist. But now that I'm older and wiser, I sort of feel sorry for him a little bit now that I'm, you know, revisiting it. So, it's interesting.
He can often be seen as the unreasonable one, but the thing you're supposed to take from the book is that we need more Howard Rourkes. What you're not supposed to take from the book is that somehow that's a treatise that we don't need government. I don't see how they get that leap.
Right.
What we need is more people that are individuals, and what we need fewer corporations, right? That's what I took from it.
Right.
I read it at 17, at a very impressionable age, I guess, and you know, I still have my original copy, which is dog-eared and highlighted and stuff. And
have you read it since?
I've read it twice since, but not within the last 10 years.
Okay, yeah, we should. You should pick it up again. We should do maybe we can invite one other person to who wants to read it as well, and we can have like a 3-panel sort of talk about it, because it's
debate.
It's great. All right, and the last one here, I know you got to run. I just put this in. Fear, 1996. It wasn't even on Arc Daily's list, but I saw it probably 10 years ago, and I just remember a few scenes of it, which is why I put it in. Stars Marky Mark, or Mark Wahlberg, Reese Witherspoon, and William Peterson. And basically, William Peterson is the architect, and he designs this really cool lake house. And I can't remember why, but the lake house is designed to resist like a Third World War, shatterproof glass, all kinds of stuff. And his daughter is coming to live with him, and she meets Marky Mark, and he's a bad guy, and he's malicious. And there's just this one scene I remember in the movie where William Peterson, architect at his drafting table, he's got to get this deadline. He's working on this deadline to get it to FedEx, so it's got to go out. And Marky Mark pops in and says, "Hey, how are you?" And William Peterson says, "Yeah." And Marky Mark, and when William Peterson, puts his back to Marky Mark puts the clock back like 3 hours. And so William Peterson, of course, not looking at his watch, I don't know why, but goes by this clock. So he thinks he's got 3. He finishes it. FedExes is closed. He can't send out his drawings. So all this stuff happened, But then basically, Marky Mark attacks the house. And I just remember, this is a scene I remember, Marky Mark picking up this huge boulder and throwing it against the glass. And of course, the glass just moving but not breaking, because it was, this shatterproof glass. And that's what I remember from Fear. So
with a very young Reese Witherspoon, by the way.
Yeah, very young Reese Witherspoon. So was an architect central to this story? They needed the house. They needed this bulletproof house for all this sort of mischief and stuff. So maybe. All right. Anything else?
Well, there's a lot of other movies that we could talk about. I do want to do a show where we talk about movies that don't have architects as characters, but are movies that are intrinsically architectural. Movies like one of my favorite movies is Brazil by Terry Gilliam.
Right.
It's a very architectural movie, and I remember that one of my professors in second year required that we watch it, and that's how I got turned on to it.
Okay. All right. We will put that in our podcast idea Evernote notebook.
But there's a lot of movies like that. Edward Scissorhands is another one where it's very architectural in how it's presenting suburbia.
Right.
So I think that's another. We'll do it another time, but that's another good episode.
Yeah, you're the one who was supposed to run here, so now you're adding all this. You want to keep talking. We'll never get a show recorded under 30 minutes. Just so if anybody's, All right. So from San Francisco, California, we'll say bye to Eric Corey Freed. My name is David Doucette, and we will. This has been At the Movies with Architects.
Thanks for listening to the ARE Podcast. Be sure to visit architectexamprep.com and check out our other podcast episodes, video tips, and the ARE blog. Remember to plan, practice, and pass.